It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. Let's talk Frankenstein. Hi guys, so it is in fact November. It is not a dreary night, but it was just an hour ago a dreary day. I'm extending spooky season by just a little bit because if you happen to see my October reading wrap up / November TBR link down below, you will know that I decided for November to reread one of my all-time favorite novels, Frankenstein, because I discovered that Guillermo del Toro was releasing a new film adaptation of the novel and was really looking forward to seeing his take on it. So I'm here to inform you that I have in fact now finished my reread. Note, this will be a pretty spoilery video, both for the book and for the film. But I mean, this has been around forever. I feel like you can't really spoil classics. And if you haven't seen the film yet, go watch it, come back. Or don't watch it and be spoiled, it's fine. Del Toro did take what I would say are some significant artistic licenses with the original work, which I think is fine. I don't generally have a problem with that as long as the adaptation is still sort of true to the essence of the original. There were some changes that I appreciated, some a little bit less so. Overall, I would say that I did enjoy this adaptation, but I'd like to go into some detail on changes that he made that I'm basically neutral about versus other changes that he made that I'm kind of conflicted about, like not sure how to feel. And then some changes that I don't think were as successful, but I am going to conclude with what I most enjoyed about Del Toro's vision for this adaptation. So let's just get right to it. Today's choice of tea mug is kind of heavy. Starting with changes that I feel fairly neutral about. This is a very different version of Victor Frankenstein. It's a much more like physical, robust kind of character. Physical in the literal sense of actually like exerting himself. Whereas the book version of Frankenstein comes across as much more sort of delicate. He too has an ego, but he's much more self-pitying and kind of cowardly. I'm going to be referring to a lot of specific quotes from the novel as we proceed with this comparison here. So let me share with you guys a couple of the quotes very early on when Frankenstein first meets Walton. Is it Walton? Yep, it's Walton. So here are some of his descriptions of Frankenstein. He must have been a noble creature in his better days, being even now in wreck so attractive and amiable. My affection for my guest increases every day. He excites at once my admiration and my pity to an astonishing degree. How can I see so noble a creature destroyed by misery? Final one. Sometimes I have endeavored to discover what quality it is which he possesses that elevates him so immeasurably above any other person I ever knew. I believe it to be an intuitive discernment, a quick but never failing power of judgment, a penetration into the causes of things unequaled for clearness and precision. Add to this a facility of expression and a voice whose varied intonations are soul-subduing music. Soul-subduing music. So he comes across to Walton as somebody very sort of quiet and gentle in his manner, and that definitely contrasts heavily with the Frankenstein that we see in the film. I also feel like there's a lot of like homoerotic undertones going on here, but that's a whole other tangent that we're not going to address in this video. Either way, I feel like both versions work. Now, book version of Victor is immediately terrified of the creature as soon as he is animated. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. His immediate reaction is horror and disgust, and he runs away. By contrast, movie Victor interacts with the creature, and they seem to kind of be mutually in awe of one another. And on Victor's part, there's an immediate kinship and curiosity. It's very short-lived, but he is not fearful of the monster. And as I was watching the film, I remember thinking, what is this scene going to look like? Because it would not make sense for this version of Frankenstein to immediately run away from the creature, because he seemed to me to be like not in the least bit squeamish. I'm glad actually that that was his reaction in the first moment of meeting his creation, because that would make more sense for his character. A couple of the other changes that I'm indifferent to one way or the other had mostly to do with his actual family. In the book, his father is mostly loving, not cruel, whereas in the film, there is this like very difficult father-son relationship that is part of what forms Del Toro's version of Frankenstein. This has some implications for the overall interpretation of the work, but one of the things that it does is that in the film, the parent-son relationship that extends to the relationship between Frankenstein and his creature is much more pronounced. You certainly get that in the novel, this idea of father and son, in the sense that Frankenstein gives birth to this creature. But as I'm reading, I'm almost always thinking God and Adam as opposed to father and son, even though in both the novel and the film, both of those are explored. Then there's Elizabeth. She doesn't grow up with Victor in the film the way that she does in the novel. He meets her as an adult. The entire character of Elizabeth is significantly different in the film, but it's not a departure that I had an issue with. Okay, artistic liberties that I am a little bit conflicted about. One big one is that in Del Toro's version of the story, the creature is eternal. He gets shot at all the time. He encounters all types of like near-death experiences, but cannot be killed. And this has numerous implications. One of them is that Del Toro can now create these like incredible action sequences, which obviously plays really well on screen, because sometimes he almost comes across as like a superhero in the film, but it also has really important implications for how his entire story arc ends. In the book, he takes his own life at the end. In the film, he decides to kind of choose life. It's a much more hopeful sort of ending. I'll address that a little bit further later on. But what does remain the same, which I think is key, is the fact that the creature does ultimately feel for Frankenstein and forgives him at the end. Now, Book Elizabeth doesn't meet the creature, doesn't even know he exists until the creature kills her. Meanwhile, movie Elizabeth is actually very protective of the creature, as though he were a young and impressionable child, which he is. She's kind of like the kind mom compared to the cruel dad, which reflects Frankenstein's own childhood. He had a kind mom that he lost, and then he had a cruel father, and the creature has a kind mother figure in Elizabeth and a cruel father figure in Frankenstein. This change does raise some issues thematically that I'll address in a bit, but I do find it also very touching, which is why I'm like a little bit conflicted about it. Okay, here's what I didn't love. Number one is that I feel like we lost some of the complexity of a couple of the key themes in the original work. One of those is the theme of beauty and judgment. Basically, the creature is too hot. He is supposed to be ugly, and I do think that it was intentional on Del Toro's part to make the creature more beautiful, but I feel like it undermines some of what Mary Shelley was trying to do. One of Frankenstein's many flaws is that he judges others based on appearance rather than on character. Here's the evidence. When Victor goes off to college, he meets a couple of his professors, and on a reread, I was really struck by his assessment of each of them. Here's how he describes Mr. Kremp. Mr. Kremp was a little squat man with a gruff voice and repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favor of his pursuits, i.e., he was ugly, therefore I didn't respect his work. Frankenstein himself acknowledges that that is why he doesn't give any credence to his ideas. Then he meets another professor, Mr. Waldman, and says this. Mr. Waldman entered shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I have ever heard. There's just something about voices. Like if someone has a nice speaking voice, we automatically think that they're a good person for some reason. In any case, this professor is not necessarily beautiful, but he is presentable enough to be respected in Frankenstein's view. Eventually, he comes around a little bit on Mr. Kremp. He thinks, I found even in Mr. Kremp a great deal of sound sense and real information. Combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not on that account the less valuable. But it takes him a while to recognize that even though he's ugly, maybe he has some useful information for me to actually learn from. Much later in the novel, when the creature is imploring with him to give him a companion, he thinks this: his words had a strange effect upon me. I compassionated him, and sometimes felt a wish to console him. But when I looked upon him, when I saw the filthy mass that moved and talked, my heart sickened, and my feelings were altered to those of horror and hatred. Again, he's just like incapable of feeling for ugliness. Now, in the film, because the creature is much more beautiful, it makes sense that Victor wouldn't immediately run away from him. It makes sense that Elizabeth would feel this kindness towards him and this desire to protect him. He's got like these big baby doe eyes. But part of what makes the creature so distressed in the book is knowing that because of his appearance, nobody will ever be able to love him. This is the tragedy of his life. It's seeking acceptance, seeking love, and coming to learn that most likely he will never find it, because upon seeing him, people will always prejudge him as evil and something to kill, something to defeat because of his ugliness. And it's kind of an indictment on the way that we all judge others based on their appearance, obviously. In the novel, there's a really sad moment where the creature sees his reflection for the first time, and here's what he thinks upon seeing himself. I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions, but how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first, I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror, and when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bittersweet sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. My annotation here was anti-Narcissus. It's like the same scene of Narcissus viewing his reflection in the pool, and instead of being so taken by his own beauty, he is repulsed by his ugliness. But in the film, when he sees his own reflection, he's kind of just like drawn to himself a little bit. He observes himself with a sense of curiosity, not repulsion. In the film, this lessens the impact of him requesting a companion of Frankenstein, because in the film, he is able to engender a sense of love and compassion from others. While it is difficult, he is capable of doing it. And this makes his request feel a little bit less desperate. The other theme that I feel gets diluted in the film is the question of what makes someone evil. Because in the movie, it's too easy to empathize with the creature and to hate Victor Frankenstein. In the book, the creature commits heinous acts. He murders a child. He pins the murder on an innocent. He murders Elizabeth on the wedding night that she has with Frankenstein. And all of this is for the sake of revenge. Ultimately, he does feel really guilty about those things. But I think part of the strength of the novel is the fact that Mary Shelley is able to make us empathize with the creature despite those heinous acts that he commits. And I'm always really impressed when an author is able to do that, when I am able to kind of inhabit a character's pain. And even if I abhor some of their actions, I can still empathize with the character. Part of the reason that we feel for him is because Shelley emphasizes this idea that if you dehumanize someone long enough, eventually they can become that evil that you initially assess them to be, even if at the outset they were kind and pure and gentle. The creature says to Victor, I am malicious because I am miserable. In the novel, the creature is much more akin to Adam, who is human in not just his inner beauty, but also in his flaws. He is capable of sin when he is angry with God, in this case, God being Frankenstein. Meanwhile, in the film, the creature feels much more Christ-like. He just endures hit after hit after hit and always turns the other cheek, never really seeks revenge on anybody but Frankenstein himself, who clearly deserves it. Now, I do want to complicate my own critique a little bit because I feel like perhaps the choice to simplify that nuance is actually apt for our current climate, and ultimately adaptations should reflect the time that they're produced in. We're living in a time where there does seem to be a huge lack of empathy towards anyone that's labeled as different or other in some way, and it's become incredibly easy to dehumanize entire groups of people. I mean, this comes back over and over again throughout history. It's nothing new, but I do feel like in some ways the film reflects that. Like maybe there was a concern that if the good guy, bad guy dichotomy wasn't made obvious to the audience, that we might not get it. This certainly does make it sound like we're kind of talking down to the audience. And there is a moment in the film where a dying William says to Frankenstein, "You are the monster." And I remember thinking in that moment, here's the high school paper thesis statement. But that said, I have seen people take the absolute opposite message from a work of art that they've consumed than the intended message. I kind of get the instinct to not let the audience get away with excusing any of Victor's actions. Okay, finally, on to things I loved about this Frankenstein adaptation. For starters, just the beauty of the cinematography and the use of color. I'm not going to go into any level of detail here because I don't feel like I have the vocabulary for analyzing visual film in this way, but I think it's just a feast for the eyes, regardless of whether or not you enjoy the plot or the thematic choices. There's one moment where Elizabeth's dress seems to have kind of like a spine that reflects the spine of the as yet unanimated creature, which ties them together in a way that we later see. And I just think that those types of details are so cool. The ending, I alluded to this before, but in the book, the creature takes his own life, and in the film, instead, he chooses life. And there's something just much more hopeful about that ending in the film that I appreciated because I feel like perhaps it's something that we currently need. In any case, in both the novel and the film, he forgives Frankenstein. And in the film, that forgiveness sets him free to actually potentially pursue some kind of happiness. I also really like what Del Toro did with the narrative structure. I think it mirrors what Shelley succeeded at doing while still making it work for film. We begin and end in the Arctic, and then in between, everything is flashback, as it is in the novel, with part one being the entire story from Victor's perspective, and then part two from the creature's perspective. And we see Walton's sympathies change from Frankenstein to the creature, which again gives us some hope for him. I also really love the cottage scenes in the film. In the book, that's actually the section that I felt most emotionally drawn to, both on a first and second read, because that's when we learn to see the creature as a human with really intense emotions and with so much capability to learn and to love. I do feel like the film captures that. And I also think that to some degree it improves a little bit upon something that I found difficult to suspend my disbelief on while reading the novel. And that's that the creature would be able to learn so much just by peeping in on their lives from the outside. In the film, there's a significant length of time when everybody in the family is gone from the cottage and only the blind old man is left. So the creature is able to spend a lot of time with him and then properly learn to read, learn about history, philosophy, etc. And that's much more realistic, I think. I also feel like Del Toro was going for a fairy tale vibe in the cottage scenes. The cottage itself definitely looks like a fairy tale cottage out in the woods. And then you get all of these animals, you get the deer, you get the sheep, you get the wolves, you get the mice. I literally remember thinking that one of the mice was going to say, "Hi, I'm Gus Gus," because it looked at the creature with these adorable big eyes and very much made me feel like the creature was kind of like this Disney prince. The whole cottage scene almost felt like a little short story within the larger film, and I love that. Now, part of the issue that I had with the creature being too overtly good in the film is oddly also, I think, one of the film's strengths, and in general, one of Del Toro's strengths as a filmmaker. I feel like we live in a really cynical time where earnestness is cringe, and there's something about Del Toro just like unapologetically being uncynical and unironic and highly sentimental that I really kind of admire. And I think that we need a voice like that. And I love that he sort of doubled down on that with Frankenstein. Okay, let's conclude. Done with my tea. There's a little bit left. My overall take on this film is a positive one because I think that ultimately the heart of the story is still there, and that's about what it means to be human. I'm going to share a couple final quotes with you from the book that I think are well reflected in the film. These are Frankenstein's thoughts. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. That idea is mirrored in something from the creature's perspective shortly after. I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. Both Frankenstein and the creature are plagued by the same pain. That mental, emotional, internal pain is more powerful than the physical pain of just merely trying to exist and trying to remain alive. It's the fact that with knowledge comes pain, and that's just the human condition, and both Frankenstein and the creature are plagued by that pain because ultimately they are both human. And I think, not to oversimplify, but that is one of the key takeaways that I've always had from this novel. And I do think that Guillermo del Toro manages to capture the essence of that. Well, that about covers my little comparative analysis here. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you will like, comment, subscribe, do all the things, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.